Hey everyone, welcome back to the range. My name is Matt. Today we're going to dive into reloading 5.7x28mm because there's a lot of fake news online about it. The FN 5.7x28mm certainly can be reloaded. Are there additional steps and safety precautions that are needed to do it? Most definitely, but it's not as scary as the internet makes it out to be. First and foremost, when reloading any kind of ammunition, you should follow all types of safety measures to ensure that you're not going to have any accidents. You don't need to come out of the gate using max loads listed in the book or something that you found on the internet somewhere. You want to wear safety glasses when priming the cases. Use a chronograph so you can actually verify the loads that you are producing are meeting spec and aren't overpressure. That's one of the biggest things I see a lot with reloading online is nobody owns a chronograph and they're just guessing the performance of the rounds that they're reloading and they have no idea whether they're actually producing a safe load or not. Now, because of the way YouTube works, hence the shirt that I have on today, doing an actual video on how to reload this cartridge from start to finish would be highly frowned upon. And generally speaking, I just want to offer some input and experiences based on what I've been doing over the last, 4 to 5 years. There really isn't any special equipment you need to reload our FN57. Obviously, like any other hobby, you can buy all kinds of tools to do all kinds of special measurements, but on a really high level, you need a press, you need dies, shell holder, powder dispenser, powder scale, dial calipers, pretty much the basics, a trim station, prep station, and that's about it. All right, our first step is that we need brass, and therein lies our first problem with our FN57. Globally, as of 2023, the main sole provider of all FN 5.7x28mm brass is FN. Fiocchi USA loads all American Eagle TMJ SS197, the Spear Gold Dot, their new Range Dynamics Subsonic, and their high performance 40 grain and 35 grain loading. If you take a look at the head stamp, you'll see that it is FN marked. Now, Vanguard Outfitters produces their own brass on a small scale that is not commercially available as a reloading component, and the same can be said for America's Ammunition Company, or AAC, which is a subsidiary of the holding company that owns Palmetto State Armory. They've gone to produce their own brass with a very similar coating to the Vanguard Outfitters brass, but that is not commercially available as a reloading component. There was an article a little while ago that NATO officially adopted 5.7x28mm, but more so or less, that's more of a marketing fluff than anything. They also adopted 4.6x30mm, but to date, there's no major country that's actually fielding either caliber in a large-scale role so that they would actually be producing their own ammunition for it. I think it's just added as a snag so that all the logistics are there to actually produce it if they were to actually field it. Now, S&B at one time made a prototype brass that to this date, after emailing, I think the CEO, they denied that it existed at all at first and then said that it was prototype and none of it was commercially for sale. Yet on a lot of the 5.7 Facebook groups, we had some people from France who were buying it and shooting it. And there was a lot that actually made it to the US for sale. I didn't get any because the person wanted me to buy the entire lot of it during COVID for like $4 grand, and that's something I couldn't afford. But that brass didn't have coating. The cases actually were cracking and splitting. So if you come across any S&B marked 5.7, do not shoot that in any of your guns. So after all that rambling, where does that leave you as the consumer? Essentially, that leaves you with two options. One, you buy factory new 5.7 ammo in the American Eagle TMJ, SS197, 198, etc., and you pull the bullet out of it and scavenge the brass and primer to then reload with your own bullet and primer, or you're going to have to buy some once-fired brass. It's available online from time to time in quantities of as many as you want, and it's around 7 to 12 cents depending on the market. I know during COVID it hit upwards of 20. Now that we have brass, we need to deviate from conventional case prep. Normally, you would do a tumbling in wet or dry media with stainless steel pins, corn cob, walnut shells, or whatever. But stop. Bad kitty. Don't abrasive tumble our 5.7 brass. This particular brass has a special coating on it, very similar to what you would find on our steel cases to prevent corrosion. It's a lacquer type coating. The coating on our brass is needed for virtually all 5.7 firearms. Contrary to the popular belief in the Ruger 5.7 Facebook group, they believe that you don't need the coating because they fired, 5 to 10 rounds and haven't had any trouble. But this is literally needed for all of our 5.7 guns, with the exceptions of the Diamondback DBX because it is a gas piston driven system, and possibly the Smith & Wesson M&P 5.7. I have not gotten my hands on that yet to review. Essentially, this coating allows the case not to stick in the chamber as it is being fired, as most 5.7 guns are a type of a blowback system. So that coating allows that shoulder to be bumped forward without that case sticking in the chamber, because what happens when that occurs is that instead of the shoulder being bumped forward, the entire case will stretch, and that's when you can actually have neck separations and then have subsequent rounds load into your chamber. And depending on the firing pin safety of some of those guns, you could have yourself a kaboom. As an experiment to this process, I did in fact remove the coating from sample brass, and reliability of gun function seems mixed. I've mainly run these polished cases in our DBX or pistols without issue, but the round count has been low and I have had some failures to feeds. But typically, if I do run subsonics, our polished cases will work. My opinion is that it takes a great deal of effort to remove this coating, so time involvement far exceeds the potential negative effects. But don't worry, there's a solution. Simple green and water. Kazam! 4 parts of water to 1 part of simple green in a container like this, and you just simply agitate the brass back and forth with a brush for 10 to 15 minutes, and that will sufficiently clean your cases. Now, there are some people who are OCD that want nicely bright polished brass, and with this particular type of coating, that's simply not possible. I know there are alternatives of people using the simple green mixture in an ultrasonic cleaner, and that possibly will help get our cases a little cleaner. Now it's time for our die selection. There are various different manufacturers that offer dies for our 5.7, from C4HD, Lee, Lyman, Hornady, RCBS. In my personal experience, I found the best luck and most economical choice is to go with our Lymans. The particular dimensions inside of our resizing die pretty much leave the coating unaffected when we are doing the sizing operations. So much so that I simply use just some one shot for our case lube. And sometimes, depending on the brass dimensions of the fired case, you can actually size them without any lube at all. Don't recommend that, because that's how you end up with stuck cases and ruined dies. But I've read, again, a lot in the forums where people are commenting that certain types of dies are stripping the coating off the brass, and that's kind of where that whole discussion about removing the coating came from. And I know Jay at Elite Ammunition recommends the C4HD dies, and again, in my experience, our Lymans are the best bet for keeping that coating intact. In my experience, as long as the majority of the case coating remains, functionality in the guns, whether feeding in the PS90 magazine or actually feeding from the magazines, should be fine. After we've done our sizing and decapping, we're going to want to clean and inspect our primer pockets. Some of the higher performance 5.7 like SS198 LF and the duty rounds actually have crimped primers, so you're going to want to use a primer pocket reamer to remove those crimps. I've found that if you are working up to more high performing rounds or max loads, that you should go to a standard small rifle primer. Don't use the CCI 5.56 military primers, because those are too hard for a majority of the 5.7 pistols. If you're just working up loads like American Eagle TMJ or SS197, in the 16 to 1700 feet per second range, a standard small pistol primer will work just fine there. Like all other bottleneck cartridges, you will need to check your case overall length, and if it's too long per the trim length recommendation, you will need to trim the necks. I have a Lyman trimmer. I've found, depending on the load you're shooting, you at times are within the acceptable tolerance not to need to trim the neck, usually with my subsonic loads. I highly recommend a good chamfer on the ID of your case mouth. The little necks on our 5.7 brass tend to be a little more fragile compared to 223. So if you don't have a good chamfer on there and you go to insert your bullet, depending on the type, if you apply too much pressure on your press, you can actually crush the case necks and then have a ruined piece of brass, which I've done quite a few times. So now we're on to bullet choice. Our FN 5.7 was ideally designed around bullet weights at under 35 grains, but because the diameter of our bullet is 224, that opens up a very wide variety of bullet choices from 223 Remington, 5.56 NATO, 22 Hornet, 22 250, anything you can dream of between 28 grains and 62. Now, a majority of our 5.7 guns are 1-in-9 twist. There was a 1-in-7 twist offered at one point from CMMG for the P90, but I think that barrel's been discontinued. I do believe the Kel-Tec P50 might be 1-in-7, but for majority of our firearms, we're looking at 1-in-9. So the caveat to our bullet choice is that you want to stay probably below our 55 to 62 grain full metal jackets. Usually our M855 and our M855A1 and some of those more specialty 5.56 bullets are actually too long to stabilize in 1-in-9 twist with our shorter barrel lengths like our pistol. Maybe possibly fine out of the 16-inch, but in any of my testing when we tried our M855A1, they were keyholing at 7 yards, and that's not a good thing. If you want to go with the ultimate cheap loading and you want to just run some 55 grain full metal jackets, you'll find good success with those right around the 1400 to 1450 feet per second in our firearms. I know you can get various different types of 55 grain full metal jackets for pretty cheap. Pictured here, I have some specialty 5.7 loads. We have a 40 grain Fort Scott Munitions solid copper spun bullet that they offered in 5.56 that you can get in components. And right here is Elite Ammunition's 40 grain pre-fragmented projectile, very similar to the T6B, but obviously it's 40 grain. I know the Hornady VMAX or a 40 grain ballistic tip bullet is very common and easy to get. AAC, again, is going to offer a 40 grain full metal jacket loading, and if their supply catches up, I probably would assume that they're going to offer that bullet as a component. Our next consideration for our reloading process is our powder choice. I myself stick to two very well-known powders, and that is our Ramshot True Blue and our Accurate number 7. I use both of these for our subsonic and supersonic loads. Now, to avoid any legalese, I'm not going to mention actual charge weights that I use, but if you look up any of the reloading information, any of the Facebook groups or on FN forum or even in any of the reloading manuals, if it includes it, a lot of what they have in there is a good starting point. I will say for our Fort Scott Munitions load, we're around 6.5 grains as a starting point. For our subsonics, you get into a little bit of a more work needed area because depending on the gun you're going to shoot them out of, they need different powder charges to actually get close to around 1075 feet per second and actually cycle the action. Our factory American Eagle TMJ and SS197 are frankly watered down. If you can safely develop loads that are getting 40 grain bullets in the 18 to 1900 feet per second range in our pistol, you're doing a pretty darn good job. I found the Hardcore Precision Gear powder funnels work very nice, albeit a little large and heavy for our 5.7 cases. Be cautious on charge weight measurements, as with smaller cases, a 1/10 to 2/10 of a grain variance can put you from an okay spot to at or above a max loading. Digital powder drops with tight tolerances help, and I tend to use an auxiliary scale to check charges every so often. I found our Frankfurt Arsenal IntelliDropper to be an okay powder drop and scale. Just ensure that the bubble level is as level as possible, even if the body itself looks off. Otherwise, I found it likes to drift a little from time to time. I also have an RCBS Charge Master that I use as well, but that tends to drop loads at a slower rate than our IntelliDropper, so I find myself going back to the Frankfurt Arsenal a lot more. After you've loaded your ammunition, I highly recommend adding a crimp station to your workflow. This is from Lee. I personally haven't had any issues with this particular one, but I know Jay over at Lee Ammunition had a video where he went through 4 of these before he finally got one that actually worked. Most 5.7 guns do not have a traditional type of feed ramp, and at times during cycling and loading process, extra pressure can be put on the bullet nose if the round is not perfectly in line with the chamber. Typically, this is why American TMJ is so problematic. It's a short bullet, and there's not a lot of bullet in the case neck. This tends to make it susceptible to setback and is most pronounced issues in our FNP90. I found when I used our crimped die and crimped 50 bullets, I didn't have any feeding issues with our American Eagle TMJ. In hindsight, doing that to all of your loaded ammunition seems quite silly. Now, I will say over the last 3 years, from everything that I've actually put in my spreadsheet for ammo usage, I've probably racked up 75 to 8,000 rounds of 5.7 testing all these various guns, and I probably can count on just both of my hands the times that I've had an actual failure with our American Eagle TMJ. So it's common, but not too common, but it's not unheard of. Now we're into the home stretch. I also recommend a case gauge to check our final round. Both Elite Ammunition and Sheridan Engineering make a case gauge for our FN57. I tend to like the Sheridan cutaway a little more than the Elite Ammunition, although it is quite a bit larger. As we alluded to earlier, 5.7 brass can be prone to be damaged easily in the reloading process, and using one of these case gauges allows you to spot those rejects before they can cause a problem at the range. You can see I'm no stranger to damaging quite a bit of 5.7 brass over the last, I think, year or so that I've been doing this, because I started writing this reloading review almost a year ago. I think that about wraps up this video, and I hope I gave you all some good insight into reloading our FN57. If you want the too long didn't read version, yes, 5.7 can be reloaded. Its normal process is just like any other conventional bottleneck rifle cartridge, with a little bit of extra attention paid to our case prep in terms of keeping the coating intact and ensuring that you have a good chamfer on your case neck, so when you're seating bullets, you don't crush the case neck or the rest of the case. With all that being said, it's time for me to get the heck out of here, but at the end of all my videos, I take a moment to thank all those who help make these possible, because there's a lot that goes into these videos. Number one is my Patreon and Subscribe Star fans. I have a link tree in the description below. Various different ways to either contact me, ask me questions, or support me through affiliate links. Those are those fancy little trackable links that probably are blocked by a majority of ad blockers nowadays, but if you click one of those, it costs you nothing and it earns me a sales commission. Number two is the various different 5.7 vendors who've helped me out through the years. That includes FN Specialties, R.A.N.G.E Weapons Systems, Vanguard Outfitters, Elite Ammunition, AAC, Sheridan Engineering for sending over one of those case gauges. And of course, number three is you all for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you at the range.